Can do is more than just an attitude. Can do is unwavering support in challenging times. It's the expertise to try to minimize risk while maximizing opportunities. Can do is being right here for you through every eventuality. Can do is Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management. Visit candowealth.com to see how we can help you build your wealth with confidence. Investment involves risk, and you may not get back what you invest. It's not suitable for everyone.
It's the week ending Saturday the 24th of September, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen Vladimir Putin mobilizing up to 300,000 additional troops to fight in Ukraine, Donald Trump and 3 of his children being hit by a fraud lawsuit after an investigation into their family business, and at least 30 million viewers in the UK watching the state funeral of Queen Elizabeth II. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team is Kate Samuelson, plus we have comedian and writer Suchandrika Chakrabarti, and back with a shiny new job at BBC Sport. It's Emma Smith. Hey, Emma.
Hello, how are you?
I'm good. You've done a reverse mateless.
Yes.
You're now working for the state broadcaster. Have you been silenced?
I couldn't possibly comment.
We'll find out. All right, so Chandrika, you're up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Why are women in Iran burning their headscarves?
The sound of crowds of protesters in Tehran on Tuesday. So Chandrika, what were they chanting about?
They were chanting, I will kill the people that killed my sister. So there are protests against the morality police in Tehran and across Kurdistan province because apparently they killed a young woman for showing some hair under a headscarf. So let me start at the beginning of the story. Her name was Mahsa Amini. She's an ethnic Kurd who was from the western city of Suchandrika in Kurdistan province, and she died in hospital last Friday after spending 3 days in a coma. And the picture started getting shared of her with lots of medical implements around on social media. So she was detained outside a metro station in Tehran by the morality police last Tuesday. Iran has these morality police to check that women are properly dressed and not showing hair and sort of fully covered. And recently they've sort of stepped up their patrol and they've been stricter than usual.
All of which is depressingly familiar for people who follow stories in Iran. What's different about this is that it does seem to have sparked these protests across the country, not just amongst Kurds, not just amongst women.
Yes, exactly. So what happened is that there was sort of an official line from the police saying that she had a heart defect and that's why she ended up dying a few days later. But eyewitnesses say that the morality police actually beat Amini around the head, pushed her against the truck and basically gave her the injuries that led to her death. And really this has sparked off huge protests, women dancing, taking their headscarves off, throwing them onto fires. There have been incredible videos across social media. And it does seem like this time they have really decided they are going to do their best to protest this very hardline leader that they have at the moment who's sort of really making women's lives even harder.
And the fact that this has sort of leaked out at all, Kate, the fact that we can see these images on social media of people protesting is in itself an act of defiance against the Iranian government, isn't it? It's a very hard line that they take out there.
Yeah, absolutely. And people do think that seeing the photos and videos circulating across social media has really inflamed the protests across the country. But notably, as these protests have continued over the last few days, restrictions have been placed on social media. Iran's Minister for Information and Communications Technology has said that for security reasons, the relevant authorities may impose certain restrictions on internet speed. But according to Reuters, and NetBlocks, which is a watchdog that monitors cybersecurity, access has been restricted to platforms like Instagram, which is the only major social media platform that Iran actually allows people to use. And also WhatsApp WhatsApp users have said that they can only send text and not pictures. And there have also been reports of the internet being cut completely in certain provinces.
So, Emma, what are the laws as they stand at the moment around hijabs in Iran?
So the laws are extremely stringent and strict. They came in following the 1979 Islamic Revolution, in which the authorities in Iran imposed a mandatory dress code requiring all women to wear a headscarf and loose-fitting clothing that disguises their figures in public. And to enforce these strict rules, they have these morality police, formal name Gashti Shad, and they're tasked, amongst other things, with ensuring that women conform with the authorities' interpretation of, in quotes, proper clothing. Officers have the power to stop women and assess whether they are showing too much hair, their trousers and overcoats are too short or close-fitting, or if they're wearing too much makeup. And punishment for breaking any of these rules can be anywhere between a fine, a stint in prison, or even flogging. So they're extremely stringent rules. There have been some protests against these before. In 2014, Iranian women began sharing photos and videos of themselves publicly flouting the hijab laws as part of an online protest campaign called My Stealthy Freedom. And there have been some other movements since, but there have not been sort of protests on the scale or with the violence, I guess, and on the scale of those seen after in the last couple of weeks after the death of Mahsa Amini.
And interestingly, when the hijab rules first came in, I've read that a lot of Iranian women didn't think it was necessarily the biggest deal at the time, and they thought they had bigger issues to deal with. For example, the fact that women in Iran don't have the same right to divorce as men. But actually, over the years, attitudes have really changed, and now many people, men and women, see the hijab rule as not allowing women to have control over their own bodies. And I read that the stats are now suggesting that the majority of the country is actually against there being a compulsory hijab rule. According to the website US News, 72% of Iranians living in Iran who were surveyed in 2020 were opposed to compulsory covering. And this was compared with 49% of respondents 6 years before, which really does show that attitudes have changed over the years.
But Suchandrika, as you were alluding to, this isn't really perhaps about a law that's been in place since 1979, is it? It's not about whether or not we should wear headscarves. It's about one of our own has apparently been killed by the authorities who are undemocratic and corrupt. And so this protest, it's broader than women's rights even, isn't it? It seems to be about the governance of Iran.
Yeah, it's really a protest against state violence. The chant that they are often coming up with at these protests is "Death to the dictator." So they're referring to the supreme leader.
Yeah, well, that's fairly clear, isn't it?
Yeah, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. So, yeah, it does seem to be the institution of the government itself and the way that it has been manifested as violence against women in this particular situation. But there's been a recent crackdown on how women dress. It's certainly been a kind of rolling back of women's rights. And so back in August, you had protests and condemnation after an Iranian woman was arrested again for defying, in this case, newly hardened hijab rules. So that was Sepideh Rashno, who was beaten by the morality police. She apparently had internal bleeding, but then she was put on television and forced to sort of confess and say that she was in the wrong. And what's actually been introduced this year is something called the Hijab and Chastity Day. That is now the 12th of July. It's a yearly thing. And so these kind of new encroachments on women's rights are seen as kind of basically the state becoming more violent towards its people and caring less how it comes across.
I suppose the fact that it's on international media, though, Kate, I mean, underreported perhaps in the West, which is why we're flagging it up here, but, nonetheless, on the internet, and being talked about at the UN is a different level of pressure, isn't it? Tell us about what the acting UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has said.
So she's called for an impartial probe to be made into the events that led to this woman's death. And actually, there was a big UN General Assembly meeting this week, and when the president of Iran arrived there were thousands of Iranian Americans gathered outside, and they were protesting and demonstrating, holding up images of people that had died in Iran over the last few years, allegedly connected to President Raisi. And there have been huge demonstrations taking place.
Yeah, I mean, that's not the debut that he would have wanted, is it, Emma, at the UN? He was giving his first speech at the General Assembly in New York, and his firm handling of the dress code rules might be playing to the gallery in Iran, but it's not how you'd want to be seen internationally.
No, it's certainly a rough start from his perspective, but obviously it's a necessary one, considering how extensive these protests have got. I mean, they are some of the biggest seen in Iran for a long time, and they go across cultural divides. I mean, he was from a Kurdish background, but these are protests that are being seen from all women from all cultural walks of life in Iran. So yeah, certainly not the start that he would have, like the first topic that he would have wanted to be sort of speaking on in his new role, but one that was absolutely necessary to address.
What do you think is going to happen, Suchandrika? Because these things have a habit of, I don't want to talk euphemistically in a glib way, but they have a habit of being clamped down on, don't they, to say the least, in countries like Iran, however virulent a protest seems to be.
I think when we see these protests on social media, we have so much hope that they will manage it this time. But I will say that even at Amini's funeral, there were protests there and they were severely clamped down upon. They were shot upon. People have died in these protests already. It is scary how quickly the state kind of reconvenes and manages to clamp down. As Kate mentioned, the internet outages as well take away another kind of very basic right, a necessity that we all take for granted, that people can't put these images on social media, and you kind of need that evidence to really get the attention of the West, don't you? So I'm really hoping that the protests outside the UN will capture a lot of the attention of people who can sanction this government. But it does seem that their power has grown far beyond what the people will take. But can they come together and actually do something that will change things? I would love that to happen, but they've got a very powerful enemy in their own government.
It's also worth noting that this unrest has come at a really challenging moment for Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah, who in many ways is the symbol of Iran's moral code. And he's a staunch opponent of the United States and its allies. And he's actually been very unwell. He recently cancelled all meetings and public appearances. And it was reported that he was on bed rest. And he's since made a speech earlier this week in which he spoke about the need to teach young Iranians about the conflict and for them to not fall for Western powers' deception, not mentioning the protests by name, but in some ways alluding to it. And commentators do seem to think that there's little hope that protests will actually make a difference and that real change will happen in Iran as long as the supreme leader is still alive. But given the fact that he's 83 years old and seems to be pretty unwell at the moment, it does feel like change could be afoot in Iran.
Okay, Kate, I'm coming to you next after this.
Can Do is more than just an attitude. Can Do is unwavering support in challenging times. It's the expertise to try to minimize risk while maximizing opportunities. Can Do is being right here for you through every eventuality. Can Do is Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management. Visit candowealth.com to see how we can help you build your wealth with confidence. Investment involves risk, and you may not get back what you invest. It's not suitable for everyone.
Okay, Kate, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
The latest chapter in an ongoing serial.
Since the inception of my administration, I've made it clear that the sole mission of my office is to safeguard communities in Baltimore through the effective prosecution of crime. And in order to fulfill this mission, our prosecutors have been sworn to not only aggressively advocate on behalf of victims of crime, but when the evidence exists, to exonerate those that have been falsely accused and convicted.
Baltimore City State Attorney Marilyn J. Mosby making a statement on the courtroom steps on Monday with a lot of live coverage on US media. Why, Kate? What was she talking about?
So she's talking about a man who's called Adnan Syed. And if his name sounds familiar to you, it's because he's the guy who was at the center of the first series of the hit This American Life podcast Serial, which was this huge cultural sensation in 2014. And many people think is single-handedly responsible for reviving the podcast format, second only to The Week Unwrapped, obviously.
And he's now been released from prison after, what was it, 23 years?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So just to cast your mind back in case you can't quite remember listening to this podcast 8 years ago, he was 18 when he was sentenced to life in prison, when he was found guilty of first-degree murder for strangling his former high school girlfriend in 1999, as well as robbery, kidnapping and false imprisonment. And he was sentenced to life imprisonment in the year 2000, but he's always claimed that he had nothing to do with her death. And now, and it's quite complicated, so I won't go into it, but after a series of retrials, appeals, having appeals rejected, that's happened over a long period of time. The news this week is that after a nearly year-long investigation into the case, some credible tips about 2 alternate suspects, one of whom is a serial rapist, have been uncovered, and as a result, he's been let out of prison.
I can't believe you're not willing to summarise the story following the murder of Hae Min Lee without 12 episodes to spin your web. But I mean, I mentioned the name of the victim there. For the victim's family, this must be very distressing, mustn't it, Emma? You know, you've got someone very high profile being released, but that doesn't mean he's innocent. He's being released to home detention. They still don't know who it is who murdered their daughter, and it's all being played out in what people think of as entertainment. You know, yes, it's true crime, but those podcasts are listened to for fun, basically, by most people.
I mean, people have described sort of like lauded Serial for helping bring about what's seen as justice in this case and sort of seeing it as our good old-fashioned sort of like investigative journalism. But it could also be seen as, you know, exploitation of terribly violent crime and, you know, this kind of thing that's often condemned in tabloid media just in a new format. Young Lee, who's the brother of the victim, Hae Min Lee, said after Syed's conviction was vacated, "This is not a podcast for me. This is real life, a never-ending nightmare." And I think that shows that while, you know, this obviously the release of Syed has been celebrated, and given that there is some credible evidence that someone else may well have committed this crime, that is to be welcomed. The fact is that the family of Hae Min Lee are now back to square one very much in terms of not knowing who killed their sister, their daughter.
I mean, I was one of those 340 million downloads, Suchandrika. I listened to this religiously when it came out originally. And it feels to me like this wouldn't have happened. He wouldn't now be out of prison were it not for a true crime podcast. That's kind of amazing, isn't it?
So last year, his legal team applied for a review of his sentence under new Maryland law, which applies to those given more than 20 years in prison for crimes committed when they were under 18, and Adnan Syed was only 17 at the time of the murder. So as part of this sentence review, an official in Baltimore City State Attorney's Office has examined these case files, and they found 2 handwritten notes relating to information phoned in about an alternative suspect. So the podcast reported this, but these notes were there in that case file and would have been taken into account in the case review anyway. But there's this possibility that the podcast has shone a spotlight onto this case, which may have got it dealt with more quickly, but as we've just mentioned, it also has repercussions for the family who see themselves pushed into the spotlight as well, when they're sort of back to square one, grieving and not knowing who's committed this crime.
What do you think, Kate? To what extent do you think the podcast has influenced his, I'm loath to call it freedom, his release?
I don't think the podcast did have much to do with his release, actually, that happened this week. I listened to the episode of Serial that was released this week, which was explaining the events that led up to why he's been released from jail. Obviously, we still don't know whether he's innocent or not, but it feels unlikely at this point that he is going to be retrialed. But it did sound like Sarah Koenig, the presenter and I think producer of the podcast, was as surprised by the events as avid listeners to Serial also would have been. And it seems like the kind of major take home from this investigation that was carried out by essentially civil servants in the US, I believe, was that they discovered that a crucial piece of evidence was held back from Syed's defense lawyers, and that is completely illegal. And that evidence was about there being another credible suspect. So I think that bit of evidence and the fact that it was not produced at the time is really a key component in why he's been released now, and it doesn't have much to do with the podcast.
Has anyone seen Only Murders in the Building?
Yes.
So that's the Disney Plus show about a bunch of true crime podcast fans who then, as a hobby, go about solving a true crime. And it hints at one of the trends, doesn't it, Suchandrika, of these kind of true crime podcasts getting attention, which is everyone becomes amateur detective when they're listening. But the point is, I suppose, that that's not how courts work. You know, people listening can say, well, he obviously did it or he obviously didn't. But you're not allowed to say that when you're on a jury. You have to say, well, we might think he did it, but we need to prove beyond reasonable doubt that he did.
Exactly. There's a narrative provided by these podcasts, which is so, it speaks to the human need for a story. Like, oh, you figured out what happened. Great. It must be that. And we want characters and we want to be kind of led to a conclusion. It's entertainment, but that's not what the legal system should be doing in any way whatsoever. It shouldn't be entertaining people. It should be about finding all of the evidence that's possible to find, laying it all out, finding what's most likely to have happened. And also, in case of like the law changing, so for instance, Adnan Syed could not be sentenced to 20 years plus now for this crime if he committed it in 2022, if indeed he did it. And so it's also about the fact that the legal system itself is evolving and changing and looking at what works within itself. So a podcast couldn't affect that kind of change, I don't think.
I mean, a major one is the hearsay rule, isn't it, Emma? So true crime podcasts have the luxury of being able to mention the criminal history of the suspects. Just 10 years earlier, he'd, strangled his ex-girlfriend, which isn't something... I'm making up that example, by the way. I'm not talking about Adnan Syed, which isn't something that you'd be able to bring up in court. But again, maybe the question isn't it wrong that true crime podcasts can do that and court can't? But maybe the question should be, well, why can't you do that in court? Like if it becomes obvious to millions of people that someone did it because of some evidence that's left out of a court case, is it time to look again at the way that evidence is submitted in court?
Potentially. I mean, you're certainly right that standards of proof are very different in court than on a podcast. But I suppose it's again sort of podcasts as Suchandrika and Kate said, they're both geared towards entertainment, and things like criminal history often sort of use sort of to tell a story in a certain way and sort of skew the narrative in the way that these entertainment shows sort of want them to go. But the fact is that's not how courts work. There was an example that the subject of the Up and Vanish podcast, Brian Duke, was found not guilty of the murder of Tara Grinstead, and the host of that podcast sort of said that because the evidence in court couldn't follow the narrative, like the narrative style as seen as a podcast, is why he was found not guilty. But the fact is that, again, that's just not how courts work. And the fact is, I think that in court you have to set out your evidence in a way that is very different to the way that it would be set out, for entertainment purposes, in a podcast.
What are the legalities around that? I mean, can anyone just reopen a cold case and set up a podcast investigating a crime?
Yes, I suppose. Yeah, I mean, like, there's obviously, you can't sort of set up a podcast and sort of investigate an ongoing case because that would lead to contempt of court or, examples like that. But in terms of, I mean, there are examples of, podcasts and sort of shows actually leading to some cases where people, where people have been, or like subjects of podcasts in shows like true crime shows in the past, where the people who've been convicted have then been exonerated or released. This is the case of Curtis Flowers, who was exonerated in 2019 after 23 years in prison for a murder. But the fact is, there are plenty of examples where there's been a popular show or a popular podcast, and then the outcome hasn't been changed, hasn't been overturned. One of the most famous examples is the subjects of Making a Murderer, which was another one of these hit shows on Netflix this time. The two subjects of those shows are still behind bars for the crimes they committed, despite these shows setting out their evidence in such a way as to make it look as though these people were only convicted.
Okay. Emma, you're up next after this. All right, Emma, you are finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Has a moment of silence lost its meaning?
Can I start by saying the eyes of the world were on this country in the last 10 days? Celtic now have a major problem. A major problem because if you're a sponsor, if you're a major company looking to sponsor a football team in Scotland or in Britain, Scotland, would you consider Celtic anymore? Not at all. And by the decision makers at Celtic being silent on this matter, they're compounding the problem. They are causing such a problem for themselves. This is not just a talking point in Scotland. This is a talking point throughout the world. They have shot themselves in the foot big time.
Former Rangers star Graham Souness talking to Talk Sport on Tuesday. Emma, what's the story?
The story this week is that a minute of silence or a minute of applause was held at all British sports events last weekend in honour of the Queen. They were also held this week before England and Scotland's UEFA Nations League matches. However, they have been disrupted in a few cases, most notably at Everton versus West Ham in the Premier League and Dundee United versus Rangers in the Scottish top division. There were boos. The match that Graham Souness was talking about there was the one that's caught the most attention. So before Celtic versus St Mirren, in an attempt to sort of fend off boos and disrupting minutes of silence, they held a minute of applause instead. However, Celtic fans sang and held a banner, "If you hate the royal family, clap your hands," which sort of has brought into sort of focus how at sporting events pay respect when a person of note has passed, and sort of whether or not it's worth doing, or if it simply leads to more problems and more issues than the respect that is being aimed for.
Or whether those problems are very specific to Celtic Football Club, which is maybe what Graham Souness was going on to say there. Because it's one thing, isn't it, to choose not to applaud. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, that they decided not to have a silence. They decided to have an applause. And presumably that's because they know there are anti-royalists in the crowd who could then choose not to applaud. That's how you would respectfully show your disagreement, isn't it? Unfurling a banner that essentially says everyone clapping here is an idiot and they're wrong on the weekend of someone's funeral, whoever it is, never mind the fact that it's the most important person in the country, is just disrespectful, isn't it? And that's something that makes this story unique, doesn't it, to Celtic?
It does to a certain extent, and certainly, like I say, there were moments of sort of like boos and shows of disrespect at some other games, but not to this extent. And certainly in Celtic's case, there's very much like sort of the anti-royalist feeling was anticipated, and certainly there was it could perhaps have been better anticipated by the Scottish football authorities. I mean, the Celtic manager Ange Postecoglou said beforehand, when asked about this, said we will abide by the protocols. When you're discussing sort of like showing respect before a game as a protocol, it shows that sort of like even if it was followed, would that have been a show of respect anyway, because there's no sort of real feeling behind it.
Well, what's the extent to that, briefly, just before we move this out to everybody else? I mean, do you think this is a minority of Celtic supporters who feel this way, and the majority of them would have wanted to pay their respects to the Queen, or do you feel that they were sort of forced into having their minute of respect for the Queen against their wishes as a whole?
More the latter. I think there's sort of been a bit of a backlash, particularly within Celtic, but to a certain extent across football particularly, and across sport as well, the idea of sort of forced and sort of performative respect. So, for example, on the weekend after the Queen's death, obviously the Queen passed on Thursday, 8th of September, and then it was decided that the matches on the weekend of the 10th and 11th in the Premier League and across Scotland and across England would all be called off. So, which on one hand, some people thought sort of seen as sort of like sign of respect. We can't possibly doing something as frivolous as playing football at a time like this. But on the other hand, it was viewed as sort of you cannot possibly do anything else other than mourn. Nothing else is allowed. And also, it was a missed chance to bring communities together and missed chance for people to show respect as a group. So, for example, the England versus South Africa Test cricket match took place on Saturday the 10th. And beforehand, there was a minute of silence. God Save the King was sung. And it was an extremely, in terms of the scenes seen over the last 2 weeks, in terms of shows of respect. It was one of the most poignant. And it was sort of the idea that football had missed out on that because they decided to sort of force everyone to sort of like you cannot play football, you cannot attend a football match, you must sort of sit at home and sort of mourn and sort of there's been a backlash, and there was a certain amount of backlash that is like, is that really the best way that people could have shown respect?
I mean, the problem is, Suchandrika, you sort of can't say on the one hand, a spontaneous eruption of God Save the King is heartwarming, but, the crowd spontaneously expressing that they don't like the royal family is somehow wrong. I mean, either football crowds should be encouraged to say what they think or they shouldn't.
It has been really difficult to know what is appropriate or not. I think just in terms of what respect looks like, I would point you towards Centre Parks. And I don't know if I need to explain, but like Centre Parks essentially decided it would be a prison for a day. It was like, people don't stay here, people do stay here, people stay indoors. And like, I literally remember saying to a friend, what is their board meeting like? What are they saying to each other like every single day? How can we make this worse? That was bizarre. But also in terms of people expressing Republican sentiment, there have been some really scary instances of people being arrested for protesting. So we had in Scotland when the Queen's journey from Balmoral, the coffin, started in Edinburgh and then came down to London. And you had a young man who yelled at Prince Andrew, not the Queen, but associated very closely with the Queen. Certain things, I can't remember exactly what he said, but suggesting he wasn't great. And he was knocked to the ground and then arrested for a breach of the peace. I don't believe we have the exact law in England, but that's quite scary, thinking, I didn't realise expressing negative things towards the royals as they walk past will lead to an arrest.
Yeah, but really, at what is effectively his mother's funeral? I mean, that's for me where I think there clearly is a distinction, isn't there? Yeah, you have the freedom to say what you think, but why do it right then?
So this is the issue, isn't it? Like, how far are these people an institution and how far are they people we can sympathise with? And I think how far you can see them one way or the other probably reflects how Republican you feel, right? Like, you can feel this anger against an institution where lots of lavish things are happening to send the Queen off to the afterlife when we're going through a cost of living crisis. You can feel that anger. Or there were lots of people in the queue that was waiting to see the Queen lying in state who were interviewed. And I found it fascinating how many people said, she's the same age as my grandmother, she's the same age as my mother. And so what you have is these two sides of the Queen and of the monarchy. And I think it's how far people believe in one or see one in themselves and their family that you can sort of measure the spectrum of how Republican or not. But having said that, it's not surprising at the change of monarch that people are going to say, hey, can we question this millennium-long situation? Like, maybe it's not good. Like, you're going to have to suggest people can do that. But how they do it respectfully, I don't think we have a template for that.
Yes, and from that point of view, maybe, Kate, there's an argument that this is on the royal family in the sense that they kind of made Charles's ascension to the throne, I know he hasn't had the coronation yet, but, him becoming king, all part of the same process of the lap of honour of the Queen being put to rest, so that it wasn't really just a week of let's pay our respects to the Queen. It was intertwined with, and we have a new king and we've got a hereditary monarchy and we all celebrate him. So you can understand why some people would just feel uneasy about that at a football match.
Yes, I can understand why some might argue that using the time of the Queen's death as a means and an opportunity to protest against the royal family as an institution feels disrespectful and inappropriate. But I do agree with Suchandrika's point that it's actually the right time to have these conversations. And if we don't have these conversations at times like this, then when are we going to have them?
Well, maybe not during the minute silence, Emma. I mean, that's the point, isn't it? There are other ways that these very fans could have expressed their views. They could have put up a banner on the website saying, we disagree that we should be applauding for the Queen and we won't be, and here's why. They didn't have to go this far.
Yeah, I suppose so. But then again, football has had quite a lot of issues with the idea of sort of performative respect and sort of the idea that if you don't show a certain level of respect or in a certain amount of way, you get criticised, and particularly criticised on things like social media or online, which obviously, as we know, can get quite virulent. Certainly.
So this is stuff like taking the knee, right?
Yeah. Yes. That is sort of one example, and also another example is around Remembrance Sunday and the idea that every player has to wear a poppy, and if you don't wear a poppy, you get death threats and like hounded, and that's been the case with the footballer James McClean, who chooses not to wear the poppy for entirely understandable reasons. He's from Northern Ireland. He has understandable reasons, but he doesn't wear poppy and gets abused pretty much every November like clockwork. And I think I think that certainly football does have an issue with that. But then again, you do make a good point that there are times and a place to make a protest and to make your point. To just be silent for 60 seconds or just applaud for 60 seconds, it's not a huge amount to ask.
I mean, it's interesting what Souness was saying in that clip that we played at the top about sponsorship. Do you think there's any merit in that, Emma? Do you think he's right that because of this moment of protest, that will financially affect Celtic's bottom line?
I don't think so. I think that Celtic as a football club is too big and too successful to be affected by that. And in the end, if you know the background of Celtic's fans and the background of the Celtic versus Rangers rivalry split across Glasgow, across, Protestant versus Catholic, Royalists and Republicans, this really wasn't a huge surprise sort of seeing these protests. And in the end, I think that while there is a greater sort of like conversation to be had about the way that we show respect in society and, the way that performative respect comes in, I don't think that Celtic are going to get a huge amount, there's not going to be a huge amount of sponsorship sort of like, or companies sort of second guessing their sponsorship of Celtic, because I think with Celtic and the culture of the club, you do know to an extent what you're getting.
I mean, Suchandrika, do you think it's time to think again about asking football teams and football fans to do anything in a coordinated fashion, frankly?
I think when it comes to the monarchy, to ask everyone to do one thing is perhaps suggesting there's one baseline sentiment everyone should feel. And I don't think it's a good idea to go to any crowd, particularly at kind of emotionally volatile time as this is, and assume you know what you're going to get back from that crowd. To go to a football team and to say, right, we want to hear from your fans what they think of this other thing, you just, from all those people gathered, you won't necessarily get the answer you want to hear. It feels like the Brexit referendum all over again. People have really strong feelings about the monarchy and whether or not it should exist. That conversation is out there, it's happening, it's one we should have. And to deny it and hold it off will anger people and they'll protest. And this is what we're seeing.
Kate?
I think it even goes further than that, because even among the people who are feeling very emotional and very moved by the death of the Queen and want to grieve, it's also suggesting that they have to grieve in one particular way. And some people might feel comforted by these collective public moments, like having a minute's silence or a minute's applause, but other people don't feel comfortable grieving in that particular way and want to do it quietly and privately, more in their thoughts than in their actions. And I think it's also not really allowing those people to do it. And I think arguably it's also not necessarily allowing those people to grieve in the way that they feel most comfortable too.
Yeah. I normally make a flippant joke at this point, but out of respect to everybody, I won't be doing that. My thanks to Kate, Emma and Suchandrika. You can follow this show for free. You can get every episode as soon as it's released. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts and tap follow. In the meantime, I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Sophie King at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.